Thank you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar in this year's Legislative Prep Series. Before we dive in, I want to take a moment to thank the Education Commission of the States, the National Association of State Boards of Education, and the National Conference of State Legislators for partnering with us. Also, a shout out to the team at LPI for all their efforts to organize and coordinate this. You all are the best. A few notes about the series. We created this series because state policymakers and education leaders across the country are facing many of the same challenges. Rather than tackling them alone, we recognize that it helps for states to come together to learn from research from one another and to share it with all of you. Each session has its own focus, a lens into practical forward-looking approaches to strengthening our education systems and making sure that they serve each and every learner. We start with the research because we believe and know that policy should be grounded in strong evidence. It's the core of LPI's work. And like our partners at ECS and NASB and NCSL, we know how valuable it is for state leaders to hear how other states are addressing similar issues. Our sessions highlight leaders from both Democratic and Republican-led states, so we can underscore strategies that work across political lines. Last month in our first session, we looked at community schools with speakers from California and Kentucky sharing how they're improving student outcomes in ways that reflect local needs. Later this week, on Thursday, we'll dig into school funding with legislators from Montana and New Mexico. But today, we turn to high school redesign, and we're joined by leaders from Indiana and Washington who will share how their states are shaping a new vision for secondary learning and success. High school redesign is a particular area of interest and commitment for LPI. It's also for me personally. I've spent a lot of years examining the possibilities of our system and our secondary schools. It's so closely tied to equitable outcomes in education, in work, and civic life, to economic mobility, to the broader redesign of our public education system. Last year, we launched LPI's Center for School and System Redesign to help practitioners, policymakers, families, and communities apply the science of learning and development to the design of schools. The center works with leaders, of all levels. It lifts up successes, it studies impact, documents redesign efforts across the country. So let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce the center's director, Cheryl Jones-Walker, to kick off today's session. Cheryl?
Thanks so much, Elena. I'm very excited to be here with all of you today to talk about the work of transforming schools broadly and high schools more specifically. Following Elena's powerful framing of this legislative series and the work of this center, I'll share a brief overview of research on high school transformation. I'll then pass things off to my colleague Ryan Saunders, who will introduce our expert panel. After a moderated discussion, we'll move to your questions, and then I'll return for a few closing remarks. Today, I'm going to share research on why we need to evolve high schools to meet the needs of students. We'll talk a little bit about what we mean by a redesigned school and how we support educators to shift policies, practices, and instruction, as well as how we build the infrastructure needed to sustain this work. So, why redesign? Well, we know the current model of schooling that was designed in the 1900s is not meeting the needs of today's learners. Large traditional schools were designed to be efficient and to focus on rote memorization. Often, large numbers of students are instructed by isolated teachers in discrete content areas. Tracking was seen as a way to meet students' needs and prepare them for appropriate pathways. Unfortunately, too often, these were determined for young people with a fixed ability mindset, and students were selected and sorted. Often it was informed by their identities, whether that was race, class, gender, nationality, language, or ability. We know that school and school district goals should be shaped by the interests and the needs of the learners, and their voices should inform policies, curriculum, and instructional practice. A recent survey by Populous found that about 70% of students say that their school is not caring or supportive. If we can go back one slide, that would be great. So in part, because of the structures of school and the pressure to cover a broad curriculum, most students don't feel well known by adults. The curriculum often feels irrelevant to students' lives, and about 75% of adolescents report feeling stressed, tired, or bored by school. As Alana mentioned, we are really looking to think about the implementation of science of learning and development, because it has deepened considerably in recent years, and high schools have not aligned with SOLD, and they don't facilitate deep relationships, which we know are essential to creating the safety and support young people need to meet success. So, what is a redesigned school? In a redesigned school, educators attend to the whole person by focusing on the conditions of the learning environment and the processes to support both learning and development. This means that the classroom and schools are personalized rather than being large and bureaucratic. The goal is for curriculum and instruction to be authentic and relevant. So often it means it is presented in applied modalities, whether that's inquiry or project-based, performance tasks with assessments, thinking about internships in communities, in and outside of the larger educational ecosystem. In a redesigned school, the learner is centered. Therefore, they are co-creating expectations, norms, and they're participating in restorative practices when problems arise. So last year, in March of 2024, LPI published a report called Redesigning High Schools, 10 Features for Success. This presents the evidence base for secondary school transformation. The features align directly with SOLD and represent schools and district practices, policies, and structures to support the adolescent learner. We have tried to group these 10 elements into three broader categories and think about providing challenging and engaging instructional design, which is our features 4, 5, 6, and 10. Creating relationship-centered learning, which is our features 1, 2, 8, and 9. And finally, building professional capacity for effective teaching and leading, features 7 and 3. We'll talk a lot more about kind of how we build the infrastructure for this professional learning. But I just want to share that our 10 features provides a research base, but examples of schools and districts that are engaged in school change efforts. And there are digital resources, videos, cases, tools, and policy reports. An upcoming center research synthesis also outlines how student experience and outcomes in relationship-centered schools that are intentionally small, the ways in which this leads to structures that increase graduation rates, boost college enrollment, and reduce racial disparities in school discipline. So moving on to talk about the professional capacity building, we'll have a chance to hear from leaders who are engaged in the process of redesigning high schools in their states and creating such infrastructures that provide development opportunities to facilitate this work. In our final chapter of the Center's report on redesigning high school, we outline the policy conditions needed to sustain systems change. These are learned from previous eras of improvement efforts. We know that districts must plan high-quality professional development, whether that's district-wide, school-based, or job-embedded. We need to build and sustain a pipeline of well-prepared educators from diverse backgrounds. And we need to select high-quality instructional materials that align with the framework for redesign. And finally, it is critical that we focus on effective and efficient redistribution of resources in order to provide support for the most marginalized learners. State and federal agencies, in order to engage in this transformation, need to build capacity within the system and create an ethos of improvement, not compliance. We need to think about the data collection and feedback and how this can support better outcomes for young people. And we need to focus on expanding powerful learning experiences and rewarding student achievement. And the reallocation of funds really need to address the under-resourced students in order to address gaps in opportunities. So I want to share a little bit about the High School Transformation State Network that was launched by NASB recently. In May 2023, NASB released a report entitled High Schools That Matter with a series of cases by experts. They focused on how can students' high school experience be restructured for their long-term success. In the opening chapter, Russell Ali and Tim Knowles outline a new architecture for high school that moves beyond seat time and credit hours. And last year, NASB partnered with KnowledgeWorks and with coordination from Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. They invited 6 states to learn together. The network is examining its practices and policies to arrive at a shared understanding of the barriers and opportunities to redesign state systems. We know that the cross-learning, cross-sharing helps to define the role of states in this high school redesign process. They have begun to learn the ways in which highlighting policy structures, ensuring adequate resources, establishing a vision for learning and post-secondary readiness, and the coordination of these cross-state initiatives are critical to the success and implementation. Our panelists today hail from two of the six states in the NASB network. The network consists of state teams from California, Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, New York, and Washington. I've had the privilege to sit on the advisory board that's charged with providing guidance on project goals, sharing relevant research, and to foster connections across the network. There's also a student advisory committee that's running parallel to the adults who are supporting these efforts. So today, we're going to learn from leaders in Washington State and Indiana. They're each at different phases in this work. The conversation will focus on their successes, growth areas, and what is next in their state in the high school transformation journey. To introduce our panel, I'll hand it off to Ryan Saunders, our Director of State Policy for LPI. Ryan is also a member of the Educator Quality Team, and he supports the work of Teacher Licensure Collaborative and the Ed Prep Lab. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. And we're now going to turn from that great look at the research and some of the overarching theory of action for this work to hear about the ways these two states, Indiana and Washington, are putting it into practice and how they're thinking expansively about the goals we are setting for learners and how to ground those goals in a holistic view of young people and how they learn and develop. We're going to hear about their common vision and how they're working to build it across their state for high school graduation and the pathways into life beyond school, and really thinking about the system-wide policies that they're working on that are going to enable school redesign and support efforts to transform the student experience. Now, to help us get a deep look at the work in Washington and Indiana, I'm joined by four amazing leaders. Hailing from, I'm going to just flag here, I'm going to introduce them, but you can get a full bio in the chat and you can hear more about their record to date. But I'm joined from the Pacific Northwest by Alyssa Muller, Director of Policy at the Washington State Board of Education, and Randy Spalding, Executive Director at the Washington State Board of Education. And then coming to us live from the crossroads of America, Byron Ernest, the Chair-elect of the Indiana Board of Education and Chair of the National Association of State Boards of Education, our great partners at NASB. And Representative Bob Benning, serving in the Indiana House of Representatives since 1992, representing House District 91. So welcome to all of you. Before we dive in, I want to remind everyone in the audience that you should feel free to drop your questions into the chat as we go. We'll make time for Q&A. But to kick us off, we have some structured questions that have been provided to the panelists ahead of time. No gotchas. We're going to start with Washington State, who's going to tell us a little bit about their Future Ready initiative and a strategic plan the Board of Education is working on, which Washington set out in 2024 on this ambitious multi-year effort to revamp the state's graduation requirements with a focus on essential skills and interdisciplinary and inclusive learning. That's tough to say together. Now, can you talk to us about this Future Ready initiative and how it's setting out to reshape schooling across the state? And as you all put it, lay the groundwork for a more dynamic and responsive education system in Washington. And I will turn it over to you, Randy and Alyssa, to kick us off.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate the opportunity. So just to ground things a little bit, in Washington, the State Board of Education has responsibility for graduation requirements, accountability, and other things. It's broad mandate around advocacy for our system of education. We're not the state education agency. And so I think that's just important grounding as we look at how we're structured in the state. And last year, the board adopted our strategic plan, and it's a different structure for a strategic plan. We were really focused in this plan on how we do our work and less about what the outcome we might anticipate at the end of that work is in terms of specific initiatives and that sort of thing. And so in doing that, we really put an emphasis on setting up a structure to co-develop our policies with those who are served in our system, and particularly focused on those who have not been well served by our educational system. And so to do this, we are working towards authentic engagement with students, families, communities that we serve. And we also formally adopted our profile of a graduate, which was developed through another sort of community-led process a few years earlier. Um, and we're using that profile as a guide as we re-examine the high school graduation requirements in collaboration with our stakeholders. One of the key challenges that we're trying to address here is that we keep hearing from students, families, employers, and legislators that there are areas where the diploma is lacking. They want additional things added, things like greater relevance in the curriculum, financial education, life skills, etc. At the same time, we hear that the requirements are not flexible enough, that they're too complex. They don't give enough room for students to explore. And so we recognize that these are all true at the same time, and they appear to be in conflict. And so it's really created this structure where we are looking at kind of how can we reconcile these things and create a framework that provides students with that agency and flexibility that they need to be able to achieve their goals post-secondary, while also meeting the expectations for that they're prepared for what comes next as well. And so that's really the balance that we're trying to find in this work. And we're working with folks who have not often been in the policy conversations through this process as well. And so we can talk a little bit more about our community engagement work around that, but really trying to work through trusted partners to connect with folks who, like I say, have normally not been engaged in this work.
That's fantastic. And I want to take kind of on the threads you described, especially that piece about we'll get more back to the community engagement and some of the work you all are doing to bring everyone along in this process, which is about building that common vision, which hopefully carries forward into implementation. But I want to think a little bit about your focus on kind of that both and of how do you incorporate kind of needs across the system for everyone's learning and also provide that flexibility, because I think that's something that Indiana has really been focused on as they've moved into their own process of implementation. So I want to invite our friends Bob and Byron. We've heard from Washington about this effort to build their new vision for high school graduation requirements and the ways it's meant to align in this broader strategic plan, connect with other initiatives in the state. Indiana is already deep into implementation for a lot of your own revamped vision of the high school diploma that includes a deep look at developing pathways that can meet students across enrollment, employment, and enlistment. And you are currently working toward full implementation of the new Indiana diploma by 2029. Can you talk to us about your own process for designing this new diploma and how that work is helping drive innovative, more personalized approaches to teaching and learning in your state?
Yeah, Ryan, it's really great to be here. And I think we need to back up just a little bit for us to maybe give some context of how we got here. And so back in 2017, we actually by the legislature, created a panel that was called Graduation Pathways Panel, which really led the work for us and the vision that we now are really operating under in that employment, enrollment, and enlistment that you mentioned for us. And it actually came about because at that time we were still one of only, I believe, 14 states at the time who had a single graduation qualifying exam for students to graduate. And that became a real passion of mine because I just didn't think that was serving our students well, right? That did not value what I always say, every path matters for our students, right? So that led our way to where we had with that 9 different pathways that our students could graduate under. Whether it be an enrollment piece where we were using SAT, ACT, whether we were using certifications, dual enrollment, those kinds of things with that. And so I think it's important that we mention that because those really led the way then for the vision that are now work that we've done with the diploma, and those things really came about from that. And I'll let Bob add to that from his perspective.
Yeah, I think Byron's hit the nail on the head. Byron and I also in 2018 had the opportunity to go to see Switzerland. And I think that became an aha moment for a number of us. And in terms of how do you get high schoolers engaged in their learning, make it more personal, but also allow them to develop the skills that employers are so desperately asking for at the same time they're learning. So Indiana, as we've kind of looked at this, has not been done in a silo. We are really worked very closely in terms of developing a robust system where our diploma is aligning with a youth apprenticeship model, so to speak. And I would suggest that Indiana probably is further along. For a long time, we were, I think, kind of chasing a little bit Colorado, but I think even Colorado today would tell you that Indiana has really made some significant uh, steps forward with that. And really the diploma and pathways was kind of the early step forward where we were kind of looking, how do we kind of make high school more relevant to kids as opposed to having what we would call remediation factories where we constantly would have to have kids couldn't pass the ECA and of course assessment for algebra, which was the primary problem we had. How do we move it to a more robust learning system that all kids could embrace and find some pathway that made sense for them? And then, like I said, the diploma then has really been a natural growth, like Byron says, from grad pathways on to the real focus right now is in what we call NCAP, which stands for Indiana Career Apprenticeship Program. So it is really a all-on effort to really move to that earn and learn model.
That's fantastic. And I thank you both for kind of helping us understand how the historical progression there, as well as the role of the state legislature in really setting that process in motion with the panel you described, Byron, and kind of taking on that mantle. I want to, before we shift to thinking about, there's a lot of focus right now beyond building that vision about what challenges you come to when you get to implementation. But I want to take a quick beat to think a little bit about stakeholder engagement. And this comes from a question in the chat, Keith, who flagged the phrase trusted partners that our friends in Washington described. I want to give you both a quick chance. Can you talk a little bit about, we'll start with our friends in Washington, about what did that stakeholder engagement process? I know it's not done. Like it's very clear you all are very deliberative in this process at each stage. But can you speak a little bit more in detail to what that stakeholder engagement process has looked like for you all? And then we'll hear from our friends in Indiana.
Yeah, thanks. So so the state board and Alyssa may want to chime in on this one as well a little bit, but we have been working towards authentic engagement through we actually brought in a community engagement coordinator a few years ago, and that person's job is really to figure out how we can reach those communities that we always are working on behalf of, but often don't hear from, and in more authentic ways. And so the trusted partner model for us has been working with community-based organizations that already have those connections to the folks we want to connect with, and working with them in order to bring their voices into the policy conversation. And so we did that through a series of contracts over the last several years. And then in the Future Ready project itself, it's very structured. We're working with the Family Engagement Network through Ed Northwest, and they've got a number of other organizations that they're working with. Again, they already have those natural connections with folks. And one of the other concepts that we're doing in Washington is we're compensating people for their lived experience and things like that. So they come in, and the coordinators who are doing the outreach are compensated, but then in addition, those who are coming to the meetings are compensated in other ways. Sometimes it's gift cards, sometimes it's other things like that, but ways to just recognize that people are bringing their expertise to the table that they might not otherwise share, or may not be recognized in some ways.
The only thing Yeah, the only thing I was going to add to that is just that as part of what Randy's talking about, as far as sort of working through those trusted partners, we have those community liaisons and they actually sit on the task force. So they're compensated for their time, and in between meetings, they're collecting feedback from their communities. And then they have sort of that extra role on the task force of having to relay that back in real time so that the task force is keeping community feedback at the center of their deliberations.
That's fantastic. I think the piece about having the coordinators, the staffing to prioritize that and kind of be that conduit is a really powerful example of kind of reaching into the ecosystem, the networks that already exist in the state. Um, Byron and Bob, I want to hear, how have you all approached stakeholder engagement in your state? And can you speak a little bit about to that process?
Ryan, I'll jump in first. And I think it even starts with one of the things that I'm really proud of I would even say my relationship with Representative Baining as the chair of the Education Committee, me as a state board meeting or member, our relationship is really tight, and we talk a lot about things, and I appreciate that. And I know that both of us have that same kind of relationship with our Department of Education right now. And I think that drives that, right? And then I would say, even going back to our pathways, we included a lot of different partners in that. We had 12 different meetings during that process of grad pathways where we had organizations come in. We had individuals that made up that committee that actually were parts of those, and so we did. But I don't want to just sugarcoat that to say that we did not have resistors or that, because we did, and had a lot of that. And then the last thing I'll say, and then I'll let Bob add to that, I would also say that one thing that we've done well with this is we have allowed early adopters. So with our grad pathway, and I'm calling those stakeholders and partners because those become partners in how to lead the way for everyone else, right? And gives us a chance to see areas where we need to do tweaks. But those early adopters, we've allowed that with grad pathways. We've now allowed it with our new diplomas, where as long as the students get the honor seals, they can opt in now with those new diplomas. And I just think that early adopter piece is a part that people forget, that those people can actually be those trusted partners or stakeholders in that too with those schools.
Yeah, I would just add, Byron actually, the General Assembly required us to move forward, to move away from a GQE with a different model. Byron chaired it. I was on the commission, my colleague from the Senate. I think a unique thing you would see that we did, Byron had an illustrator at every meeting that would illustrate a lot of what was being discussed in terms of topics. To Byron's point, it wasn't an easy process, and there were the resistors. I think that probably the one moment that I remember most is when the plan was actually adopted, and our principal association, which would be one of the ones you would think that you would want to bring along, they were livid about the whole process. But I think if you reflect back to when it was adopted and look today they're wildly appreciative of the whole process. And I think the other thing that Byron brings a great point up, we allowed for early adoption of both the grad pathways and for the diploma track. And so when you see a number of schools raise their hand early on saying, hey, I want to be taking advantage of this early, that is I think a representation that we've really hit something that resonates with the constituency out there, that they really want to embrace this change and see it valuable for the students that they're serving as opposed to where we were before.
That's fantastic, and it kind of sets up this next question, because I want to name the effort to kind of develop and give space for the early adopters to kind of pilot and test likely provided you all a lot of early information about how the challenges those other stakeholders may encounter, other groups, as they try to push this and scale it statewide, which really connects back to when Cheryl was describing this kind of improvement cycles mindset that states and leaders all kind of adopt and really are thinking about how we're really measuring progress, because these are huge systems we're talking about, and trying to change and move them requires kind of an awareness of a lot of different ways this may play out and a lot of different metrics for progress. So I want to kind of think a little bit about how you all are thinking about measuring progress and put a little more finer point on that question. I'm going to start with Randy and Alyssa. We again hear a lot about implementation challenges when it comes to this work. It's very sometimes a little bit easier to set the vision maybe, but then bringing that vision into practice can carry a whole bunch of other challenges. And part of that is having a clear sense of where you're going and how you're going to measure where you're going. So can you talk a little bit about how Washington is thinking about measuring your own progress as you move toward implementation? I know you said a lot about how you don't necessarily have the end in mind, but I'm curious how you're thinking about maybe what are some kind of signposts that let you know you're going in the right direction, maybe.
Yeah, thanks for that. And yeah, so we're still building it. So I put that caveat in first. But I would say, kind of referencing back to our strategic plan, we identified two different kinds of metrics in our strategic plan. So one are sort of the traditional, typical kinds of metrics you would see, things like assessment scores, graduation rates, post-secondary attendance, et cetera. And we actually worked with LPI a few years ago on kind of building that out with some more predictive measures and things that were a little closer and more timely to that. And so part of our strategic plan will be to return to that framework after we've developed the Future Ready initiative to look at what the system is doing. But we also recognize that as a board, we are not the ones delivering education, so we're not the ones who can directly impact those metrics. And so we thought it was important to have some metrics that held us accountable for what we said we were going to do in the strategic plan. So those tend to look more like, are we doing the kinds of authentic engagement that we intend to do? Are we reaching the kinds of the populations that we want to reach? Are we getting that sort of input and using it effectively? How are we using our own resources as a board? So does the amount of time on our board agendas match up with the priorities that we have as an organization, for example? So those are the sorts of things we're doing in terms of measurement. I'd also say that implementation is absolutely key, and we've seen that across all of our initiatives. And so we've got two different subcommittees in our task force for Future Ready that are looking at different elements of implementation. So one of those is focused on what we would traditionally think of like, do we have, supportive class scheduling, and do we have the resources necessary, and et cetera. We have a second subcommittee that's really looking at the educators. Have we built in provided the kinds of professional learning and support that they need in order to deliver on a student-centered educational approach? And so that's the other element that we're bringing into that. So they'll be making recommendations that will inform our proposal at the end. So it won't just be we're going to change the requirements in this way, but we're going to change the requirements, and in order to do that, we need these additional things to make it happen.
That's fantastic. And naming that piece, again, back to my colleague Cheryl's presentation and thinking about the principles of redesign, that need to build capacity across the system, and particularly for educators and leaders, given they are the ones kind of on the ground bringing this work to life. I think that's a really helpful reminder for everyone to how they're positioned within where you all are at in the process to kind of refine that next phase within that subcommittee and think carefully about that. So I appreciate you kind of calling that out and naming that. Byron and Bob, can I bring you in on this question as well? I'd be curious how you all are thinking about implementation and measuring your own progress right now, and any early signs of success. I think you described a lot about those early adopters and the success of those pilots. I think you described as well the principles as maybe that's a good measure of success as well. The initial kind of reluctance or resistance turns into kind of champion of the work or kind of going along. Can you speak any more to other signs of success, other ways you're thinking about progress?
I'll talk a little bit, maybe not success, but ways we definitely have been monitoring. Pathways was, and obviously a new venture for Indiana and provided a lot of flexibilities for schools. What we noticed shortly, probably 2 or 3 years in, is under the category of enlistment, we had allowed a ASVAB score of 30 what we used is the qualifying score to get in the United States Army is what we used. We had a lot of debate. We had the military come in, and they at that point in time, the U.S. Air Force, I believe, was 50. I think the Navy was in the neighborhood of 40, and Marines probably a little bit above, but Army was 31. So we used 30. We used the qualifying score to get the United States Army. What we found was that schools were using that as really a avenue to get kids qualified. And so in their accountability, they would immediately say, well, they've met the requirements for a diploma. So unfortunately, they took the pathway of least resistance, and we were very concerned. The legislature stepped in, told State Board, you have to close this loophole. And at the same time, the United States military was not meeting its recruitment numbers, and therefore they had reduced the number qualifying. I think at one point in time, ASVAB for Army got reduced to 10. So it's 10 percentile on ASVAB score. As a note, today, the United States military is actually hitting their recruitment numbers. In fact, the Army hit it 2 months early and actually has a waiting list. But because of that, we had to go make adjustments because we wanted to make sure that this was being used in an effective way, that kids were really taking ASVAB with the desire of going to the United States military rather than taking ASVAB as a checkbox on the pathway to graduation. So, and then we continue our monitoring the number of kids and the selections that they are using as a pathway, and we'll intervene appropriately. State Board is also allowed for. We have locally created pathways. There's probably not as many of those coming in front of State Board now as there were initially, but we always want to make sure that we're robust options, that we're going to not dead end kids, but really provide an opportunity for them to have that next step in life. I don't know if Byron has anything else.
Byron, you want to jump in at all? We can keep cruising.
I would say the next phase of this, Ryan, now that we're in the last phases of a new accountability system for Indiana, I would say we've also built this into that as well, to where we have really gone to a multiple measures, very student centered. So all of our data in accountability now revolves around the student, as opposed to the way I think it's been done forever, where it's around the school, right? Where now each student is looked at as an individual. What are the data points that they've done? Not that we still have the academic success and proficiency on our exams is important, but we also know all those other areas. Again, I go back to what I said, every path matters for kids, right? And so therefore we've really steeped into that new accountability to where we have lots of different things being looked at for each student.
That's fantastic. Now there's some questions coming in the chat. We are going to get to those in a moment. I'm going to try to give you one more prepared question. But also, I forgot to do this as we were going, but I want to give a shout out to Representative Banning. You described the international study group that you were a part of that went to Switzerland. I believe that was through NCSL, National Conference of State Legislators, also a partner here. Just want to name the great kind of connection of that work to your work. So always excited to see people learning and finding new models. Go ahead.
And to shout out to that, I will say the work we did at NCSL's International Study Group honestly has been the catalyst for where Indiana is today. Indiana has been very fortunate that we have a local foundation that has embraced our work, and over the last 2 years, 3 years, it's probably taken 400 people to Switzerland to experience it, and you can see the development of what we're doing based on the investments that they're making. They're making significant investments in pathways.
And we'll include. I know there was a summary report, I believe, that came out of that study group.
There was a report that I was intimately involved called "No Time to Lose."
Yeah.
It's the most requested report NCSL's ever done. But there's been a follow-up international study groups that have also had some additional reports.
That's fine. We'll make sure to include that in the follow-up. I want to get to one more prepared question, then we're going to turn to the Q&A. There's a lot of great questions, a lot of connections to things you've already been talking about. Now this one, it may touch on things you've already said, but I want to just take a moment to really reiterate a few things with a focus on kind of lessons learned, challenges for people to things people can take away from your stories and your progress. So we know everyone generally here is thinking about different opportunities to advance more innovative, personalized schooling and learning opportunities, redesigning high school, thinking about building and reshaping these systems. What lessons and advice would you like to elevate for them to put a finer point on here? And can you share a few pointers on what to do and perhaps what not to do as groups move forward, other states think about implementing, driving this work? I'll start with Indiana. Byron and Bob, do you want to jump in first?
What I think, yeah, I will start, and I think I'm going to use maybe some examples from my own personal professional life of what I do as well. I think one thing that really has to happen with this, if we're really going to make high school relevant for our students, then we also have to work with industry, and that's every part of industry, to be able to know what is needed for our students, as well as help them to be partners. So, for example, I'm doing some work with Indiana Pork, our association of the pork industry in Indiana right now, who have really taken a leadership role that I've not maybe seen some other organizations do, or businesses, where they've actually created their own work-based learning program that they're now going out and working with both on the business side of it as well as the schools, and making that connection. So I think if I was to say one piece of advice, and you can say, well, maybe that doesn't have anything to do with policy. Well, it does, because I think we need to be looking at what does industry need in this space, because we're also looking at what does liability look like in this space for them, right? Just to give an example. So I think that's one piece of advice, is not to leave. And I think Indiana's done a great job, particularly under Representative Bainey's leadership on this. We've done a good job of including industry in that. So that would be my big thing from a what should we be doing kind of thing.
I agree with Byron. There's a couple other things I would add is as you're redesigning, first off, I'd look at data, and data has helped inform what we're doing. I mean, clearly, when you see that 25% of your high school seniors are chronically absent, you know that there's a reason for that. They don't see high school as being relevant. So we have got to change. The system, as we know today, is not meeting the needs of most of our significant number of our high school students. So that was something that drives that. But I think there's a couple other things that you have to look at. Number one is Indiana's per capita has more manufacturing jobs than any other state in the union. So as we have kind of partnered with employers, where we have a work-based learning requirement in our diploma, it was part of the pathways as well. That is probably one of our biggest struggles today, honestly, and challenges, is getting employers, even though Byron says, yes, we are engaging with employers in a big way, but changing the way they think, because so often employers have stood outside the door at the high school saying, I need this, you're not sending me what I need, but they're not willing to get in and engage. And so changing that thought process and really getting them to understand, if you want the students developed to meet your demands, you're going to have to get in and get a little bit dirty. And you're also going to have schools understand that you can't use education lingo with employers, because they don't understand. And so it's almost two different languages between the two. And then the last thing I'll say is, and it's still something we have not figured out totally, is I mentioned the fact we're number one in the country, or number one or two in terms per capita in manufacturing. Manufacturing's changed a lot. Advanced manufacturing is not at all the factory that when I grew up. It's not dirty, and many of them are computerized robots, everything. Byron and I've been through and seen a number of those, but still we have issues with liability. And how do you engage and take a high school junior, senior, and put them in this? And I actually have a meeting tomorrow where we're trying to figure out, we've done a couple things. We've looked at a couple of different states. Kentucky has, I think, worked with a group called the DECO, and created a model where they use like an employment agency, but it is really probably one of our bigger challenges, as well as changing the mindset of employers. And one last thing I will say, we are through the philanthropy of the Richard M. Fairbanks Foundation, we have taken what were normally considered advocacy groups like the bankers, the manufacturers, and asked them to start looking at this instead of advocacy where they're lobbying us or state board or somebody to look at a talent development pipeline. And so that has really been a huge help where we've got these groups coming together that, in fact, I was talking to somebody over the weekend who said that healthcare will end up opening jobs in 5 different hospital systems in Indiana for Indiana youth next school year. So engaging employers is critical, but it's also the biggest challenge we have.
And I think that speaks back to that a question of the effort to engage stakeholders at every stage of this work. You really describe kind of a process of translating the work to different audiences so that you can build that common vision. Building the common vision isn't getting everyone to like agree to the same language necessarily, but it's understanding it from where they sit and their priorities and kind of agreeing to work kind of towards that common space in the middle. So I think that's fantastic in terms of the work that you all have done with industry to bring them along. And I think your framing of kind of the advocacy groups as well, how to get them rowing in a common direction. I also, and just thinking real quick, there's a question here that kind of thinks a little bit about how we're helping students think about this and kind of going back to the stakeholders and other people involved. Like obviously the students going through this system are fundamental. But Randy and Alyssa, I want to give you all a little space to first respond to that question, and then we'll talk about kind of how we're providing resources and services to students. But yeah, if you guys want to first think about the lessons you all would describe.
Yeah, I think I think kind of where you just were landing there too around that sort of communicate how we are communicating with the various stakeholders. And so as we entered into this work, we have as I mentioned, we're trying to reach folks who've not been involved in policy conversations. So that requires one kind of communication. But we also have all the what we would call the usual suspects, the people who are at the table, and we need to kind of keep them in the fold as well and build coalition around them. And so, I think the some of the things cited at the top in the research presentation is really helpful because those are the same problems that we're trying to solve. Like it's in the chat as well. How do we engage students more effectively, right? How do we do all those things? That's a common thing. Everybody in the system wants to do that. They want students to be engaged. They want students to learn. They want them to be well prepared for what comes next. It's the how that gets sometimes a little bit tricky. And so sort of really building the coalition around those common threads. And the other thing I would say is that as we entered into this initiative, I mean, we knew we were taking on something big, and we're a pretty small group, and we knew we would need time. And because you cannot move this through this is not something we could do between 2 legislative sessions. This is spanning a couple of legislative sessions. So really building in that time. And again, that's where the communication becomes essential because we need patience from a lot of different parties to kind of work through this as we get to a proposal that is going to take a couple of years. And in this instance, 3 legislative sessions from start to finish, assuming we get it done when we hope to get it done. But so being willing to take that time, but also to try to ensure that all the partners are on the same page to say, yeah, let's wait on making additional shifts in things while this process plays out so that we can have a good product at the end of it and a good proposal at the end of it that meets the needs of all the various stakeholders and partners. Alyssa, is there more you would say on that? We also, I should just mention, we learned a lot from earlier work that she led in our mastery-based learning and cloud competency-based piece. And so maybe there's a piece there that you'd want to draw in, Alyssa.
Yeah, you're reading my mind, Randy. Through some of our mastery-based learning, also known as competency-based education work, I feel like we learned a lot about what works and what doesn't. Certainly, we benefited from watching some earlier states try to mandate competency-based education and seeing that that didn't go very well. So in Washington, we went with more the coalition of the willing approach and finding ways to really support school districts through funding when it's been available from the legislature, as well as providing technical assistance on how to really implement culturally responsive, competency-based education in community with other schools doing the same work. So often we found that schools just need that explicit permission to be innovative, and then have the support and thought partnership from state leaders and from their peers, other schools doing that same work, to figure out how to make existing state level policy that's often as flexible as schools need work in their context with their community. We found that districts have all different starting points for this work. But I think if the goal is to focus on making learning more relevant and engaging for students, then schools can be really creative in building from what they already have in place based on their local context. So maybe a school already has great work-based learning opportunities, and so it's finding ways to bring in more of what students are learning outside of school into the classroom. Maybe districts already have a good structure for professional learning communities and collaboration time, so it's having teachers team teach an interdisciplinary course. I feel like there's a lot of different ways to support personalized student-centered learning opportunities. It's just helping districts think through what works in their context.
That's fantastic. And I just to put a finer point on that, kind of writ large, there's a lot of different ends to this work. When you describe, I think, your mastery-based work that preceded this push on the Future Ready initiative, you described your broader efforts on the profile of a graduate as well as kind of feeding into this work. And then you think about Indiana with the work-based learning and apprenticeship, kind of all these other ways this work can take shape and drive this bigger vision of innovation and redesign. And also, both of you talked about there's kind of this tension. You want to build this system out while not holding back your early adopters, or also allowing them to move forward and taking lessons from what's happening with their work. And I think that's another key piece here. You're building policy as you go, while also not necessarily stopping people from doing the work they may be ready to do, and using that as a model to kind of drive further change and scale. And then also, again, I think there's an underlying piece here. It takes a lot of time, and continuing to commit that political will over time to do this and do it right, and not kind of get off the rails, not change it midway. Like that takes a lot of, well, changes within reason, but not necessarily abandon it. And I think that's hard. That's not easy. I mean, we're looking at legislative sessions the past few years and looking ahead where there will be a lot of different things happening in states. And so I think it's really powerful just to remind people that some of the work is keeping people engaged and moving towards, for Washington, it may not be that outcome, but that common vision. And I just to kind of speak to that a little bit more, I'd be curious for this audience. We see this for a lot of different audiences, but we also keep state legislators in mind and thinking about the next session. Is there any further advice you might give for specifically thinking about a legislator and what role they could play in supporting or driving this work in their state? And we'll give a few minutes to kind of hear what you all think. And anyone can jump in depending on who has the moment.
Ryan, I want to jump in because I want to say one thing that I think that we've done, and this again was under Representative Bating's leadership, and I've had the chance to be part of some of it. But we've done a couple of things that have helped drive this. In that, a few years ago, we enacted what was called a 1003, because that was the bill name, flexibility waivers for schools, which enabled them to come up with what are things that we need to do from Title 20 is our education rule in Indiana. And what are things that you need to do to get out of the way of doing the work that we've just described on this whole call, right? And then I would even reference right now, Representative Baining's doing a lot of work on what are some things in Title 20 that just need to be changed or eliminated that are keeping us from having the flexibility that we have. And so I think if I was giving one piece of advice, it would be, how could we change things to get the rule policy out of the way, right? For schools to be able to innovate, but yet still be held accountable for the good work of our students.
I would, as a legislator, for instance, I know the state of Washington, Sharon Tomiko Santos is a very good friend of mine. Sharon chairs the House Education Committee in the state of Washington. honestly, I will say that we've learned a lot together, and obviously we're opposite parties, blue state versus red state. But one of the things that I do frequently, and number one, we do a lot of collaboration, but I also work very closely with a lot of advocates. Like during session, I have after on Thursday afternoons, I always have a group of individuals representing all the different education groups together, including state boards. So Byron is usually there. So, we really talk about policy strategies. It's really the goal of trying to make sure that we're all working together, not working against each other. And really, one person can't have all the ideas, and really trying to coalesce and bring great ideas forward in terms of General Assembly. But clearly, I think there's a number of legislators across this country that I can name that are very, very definitely involved in education and have had a great career in terms of working collaboratively. But I think working with state boards and governing bodies is very helpful as well, because we like to, I don't think any is unique in the fact that we do kind of put the groundwork together, and then defer to state board to put the really the meat on the bones. Now, I will say, I was meeting with Secretary Jenner the other day, and somebody asked her a question if does the legislature have any authority over that, and she was like, I wish there was a day and time the legislature didn't have authority over something. So if they get too far off the rails, there's times where a state board has get stripped back. But dereg is an issue too. I really believe that our system of governance and our system, when we look at education, is not changed in 120 years, and we need to be moving more to professional system as opposed to a manufacturer's type, which is something we learned in the International Study Group. Really, and we have a manufacturer's model where we regulate all the inputs. I'm trying to get moving to the point where we're looking more at outcomes as opposed to, I really don't care as much how you get there as long as kids are going to be successful in the end. And let's move and let educators have more control over their lives, which is one of the reasons why we're looking at dereg as well.
Thank you. And Randy and Alyssa, I want to give you one last word. We have to kind of wrap it up. I want to give you one last thought here on that question, then we'll shift to Cheryl.
Yeah, just really quickly, I would just say that, yeah, that relationship with the legislature is really essential in the work. Our competency-based work was really driven by the legislature, and it's something that we really dove into. And then on the future ready work, we found that it's really our coalition of partners working with the legislature to say, because it's hard to say take a pause on new policy, new ideas related to graduation requirements. But I think that this message has resonated with a lot of folks, and we haven't seen a lot added during this time that we're working on this. And so that's a good thing for the moment, even though there's a lot of urgent things that we need to address, right?
Well, thank you all so much. I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Cheryl Jones-Walker, to wrap it up. And again, thank you so much for joining us. Cheryl? Cheryl, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry. Appreciate everyone being with us today, and really just deep appreciation to our panelists, not just for sharing their time and expertise, but their willingness to share some of the challenges, which we can all learn so much from. I hope, like me, you've been inspired by their work. Appreciate you, Bob, Byron, Randy, and Alyssa. I wanted to call your attention to the fact in just 2 days, and on Thursday at 11, we'll be here again, same time, same place at 2 o'clock Eastern time. We'll be talking about the ways in which states are negotiating budget concerns and thinking about education funding in these times. So please come back and join us for that if you're able. I also just want to encourage you to be in contact with us at the Center for School and System Redesign. You can take this QR code and sign up for our newsletter, look at our website, be in touch with us for upcoming events. Really appreciate all of you being here and want to thank you and wish you well as the holiday season approaches. Thanks also to Ryan for your expert facilitation and wonderful questions, and to Elena for her opening remarks. Have a good afternoon.